You drive down an interstate and expect history to be a museum. Glass cases, neat placards, dates that click into place. But what if I told you that in Georgia, the state you think you know, the landscape of peaches, traffic, and sprawling suburbs, there are places where those glass cases shatter and everything becomes louder, stranger, and older than the maps let on. Picture Atlanta's glass towers dissolving into low mists and red clay. Picture highways evaporating into tidal marshes and primeval hollows where the ground itself seems to hold a memory that scientists, storytellers, and local elders still argue over. That contrast, between our tidy expectations and the unresolved, uncanny places underfoot, is where this story begins. I want you to walk with me into those fogged edges, because these are not just archaeological footnotes. These are thresholds where the past still breathes, where artifacts refuse to sit politely in a display case, and where the simplest questions ripple into profound mysteries. Who were these people? Why did they carry stones and shells into perfect circles? What could explain an earthen mound so large that it reshapes the skyline of a river valley? We will look at dates, measurements, artifacts, and competing hypotheses, yes, but I also want you to imagine the sensory details: dawn fog clinging to field grass, the metallic taste of salt on your tongue from the marsh, drums that echo through a night that never fully ends. Because the real point of these mysteries is not mere trivia. It is to reconnect us with a kind of human wonder that modern certainty has tried to domesticate. From the very start, we must be honest about what we claim to know. Archaeology gives us remarkable tools: radiocarbon dating that brackets a hearth's last fire, isotopic analysis that whispers where a person likely ate and lived, stratigraphy that orders time like layers of a cake. Still, when the evidence grows ambiguous, multiple, conflicting narratives rush in to fill the gaps: scientific models that emphasize climate change, trade networks, or technological innovation, local legends that speak of lost tribes, giants, or curses, and the kind of myth-making that thrives wherever answers are scarce and the imagination has room to run. My promise to you is this: I will present the data as clearly as I can, dates, cultures, measurements, and I will also give those other voices their due, because a mystery isn't always solved by a lab result. Sometimes it is made alive by a story someone has told for generations. Keep your skeptic's hat handy, but don't let it block the view. We won't pretend every gap will be closed by the next laboratory report. The most honest thing I can say at the outset is that some of these places remain stubbornly, wonderfully unresolved. So let's walk. Imagine yourself on the shoulder of a quiet state road just before dawn. The air is heavy with a summer humidity that has learned 1,000 quiet languages. Behind an old corrugated barn, the land gives way to a ring of pale sand and crushed shell, rising in a low, deliberate circle. A few miles away, a terrace of mounded earth climbs like a man-made hill above a lazy river bend. If you stand at its base and tilt your head, you can almost feel the organized labor that made it, thousands of people moving dirt by hand. In other places, on islands where the tide breathes in and out like a living lung, ancient middens, piles of shell, food waste, and tools, sit exposed and glinting under the light, their patterns hinting at rituals or marketplaces or something else we cannot name. These are the scenes we'll return to again and again: marshes, mounds, shell rings, carved stones, tracks of trade where copper met chert, and a valley in Georgia linked to the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. Science gives us context. Folklore gives us soul. Together they make these places sing. Picture, then, the first of these sights in your mind: a low curve of sand and shell on the coast, shaped so deliberately that it could be mistaken for a piece of human design even at a glance. This is the Sapelo Island shell ring, not one ring but one of several around Georgia's barrier islands, formed in the Late Archaic period, roughly between 2500 and 1000 BC. The ring is not a single discovery. Archaeologists have mapped multiple shell rings along the coast, each varying in diameter, some as small as 30 meters, others stretching to more than 100 meters across, and built of concentric deposits of oyster, clam, and other shellfish refuse mixed with charcoal and cultural debris. The sheer scale of these rings suggests communities that were surprisingly sedentary and organized for a time usually associated with mobile hunter-gatherers. Excavations have uncovered hearths, bone tools, pottery sherds, and floral remains, each a sliver of life writ in calcium carbonate and carbon. Here's where it gets tricky. One set of theories argues the rings are the byproduct of long-term refused disposal by semi-sedentary coastal communities, effectively ancient trash heaps that, through habit and necessity, took on a circular form. Another theory posits a far more intentional, ritual-based origin, rings built deliberately to mark sacred precincts, social spaces, or calendrical sites. Radiocarbon dates from some rings placed their primary formation firmly in the Late Archaic, yet there are also layers that suggest shorter periods of occupation or episodic use, leaving room for both hypotheses to coexist. Then there are the ecological considerations. Sea level fluctuations, storm surges, and changing salinity of the estuaries could all have shaped how and where people lived, concentrating activity in certain places and encouraging the formation of dense middens. Still, for all the evidence of diet and domesticity, charred nutshells, fish bones, shell tools, some rings show patterns of deliberate construction, raised berms, uniformly distributed hearths, and gaps that may indicate intentional entrances or ceremonial avenues. Mixed in local oral traditions that speak of people who lived at the edge of the water, or sightings of ghostly processions along the marsh at dusk, and you have a fertile field for hypothesis and myth both. Now, let's be fair, shell rings are not unique to Georgia. Similar structures appear along the southeastern seaboard and even across the Atlantic in other eras and cultures. That comparison opens more questions than it answers. Did different coastal communities independently invent similar strategies for living at the edge of abundant marine resources? Or was there communication and shared ritual across surprisingly long distances? Some archaeologists point to trade and seafaring routes, evidence that people were moving exotic items, such as non-local stone and marine shells, across significant distances as early as the Late Archaic. Others caution against overeating a handful of artifacts. Convergence in architecture can arise wherever similar environmental pressures exist. Still, the presence of finely worked bone implements, early pottery forms, and concentrated hearths suggests social complexity. Picture yourself walking that foggy marsh trail at dawn, the soft pop of shell underfoot, imagining families leaning over smoke-stained hearths, children learning to thread bone on fibers, elders keeping time by tides and stars. The ring becomes not a static artifact but a living circumference of human life. And then there's the mythic overlay. Locals sometimes tell tales of ring people, ancestors who danced in circles beneath the moon, or spirits bound to the shells and mud. One story whispers of a lost village that vanished beneath a sudden storm that raised the sea like a hand. Science contests sea level curves, storm frequencies, and subsistence remains. Science cannot entirely dislodge a story passed through generations. Perhaps both are true. The ring was a workspace, a home, and a stage for ritual. The more we dig, the more the lines blur between mundane and sacred. Still, for all the evidence of structured living and environmental pressures, the question remains, were these rings simple refuse, or were they deliberate monuments to a worldview we no longer share? We still don't know. Move inland now in your mind, away from the salt marshes and the hush of surf, and imagine a river that has been a highway longer than any asphalt, the Ocmulgee River Valley. Rising from the floodplain like an intentional city mound is Ocmulgee Mounds, an earthen complex whose visible history, in plan and scale, seems to cross both time and imagination. The site's greatest constructions belong to the Mississippian cultural horizon, roughly from 900 to 1450 C. When mound-building societies across the southeastern United States reached high levels of social complexity. At Ocmulgee you find massive platform mounds, flat-topped, steep-sided earthworks, some reaching several meters high and commanding the landscape. Measurements from early surveys showed earthen rises stretched across multiple hectares, with plazas, residential areas, and evidence of long-term habitation, post holes indicating wooden structures, pottery styles tied to Mississippian iconography, and trade goods such as copper fragments and marine shell ornaments that traveled inland from the Gulf Coast. The key discoveries here point to a hub of political and ceremonial activity. Copper plates, sometimes embossed with stylized birds and humans, hint at an ideological system that used iconography to connect rulers, cosmology, and warfare. The very labor investment in constructing earthen mounds, moving tons of soil by hand, speaks to organized political leadership or ritual obligations that could marshal communal work. Yet when we try to read that leadership with our modern eyes, uncertainty blooms. Was this a hierarchical polity with chieftains accumulating power through trade and control of ritual spaces? Or was leadership more diffuse, rotating through kin groups and embedded in communal ritual? Some evidence, like the presence of elite grave goods and platform mounds likely supporting temples or chiefs' houses, leans towards social stratification. Other features suggest strong communal participation, plazas that would have required many people for public gatherings and feasting. But here's where it gets tricky. The timing and meaning of occupation at Ocmulgee and its neighboring sites are not uniform. Earlier woodland and Swift Creek period occupations overlap in the stratigraphy with later Mississippian constructions. Radiocarbon dates sometimes show palimpsests of repeated building events. That raises the question, did Mississippian elites appropriate older sacred centers to legitimize their power? Or did continuity of place, already significant ritual landscapes, naturally evolve into more complex political forms? One clear piece of data is trade networks. Artifacts made of non-local chert, marine shell, and copper show that Ocmulgee was not isolated. The presence of such materials indicates long-distance connections, roads of exchange, if not constant travel. How did these networks operate? Were they trade routes run by merchants, obligations carried by kin networks, or tribute exacted by powerful polities? Competing theories place emphasis differently. Some archaeologists invoke the dynamics of regional systems of exchange that create centralized polities, while others argue for the primacy of ritual centers in organizing people and resources. Now, add to that the mythic and sensational. Local stories, some recorded in early Euro-American accounts and others preserved in native oral histories, speak of mounds as the homes of spirits, or as the works of an earlier, giant race. Early explorers and settlers often misinterpreted indigenous social complexity through a lens that invented or exaggerated the exotic, yet the persistence of certain motifs, giants, sky people, and ancestral watchers, indicates a human need to make a sacred landscape legible. Picture yourself climbing the gentle slope of a platform mound at dusk, the air thick with mosquitoes and song, and imagine a plaza where people gathered to watch dancers, artisans, and priests in a performance that knitted social life to cosmic order. Imagine too the labor that stacked soil mound upon mound by hand, an act as political as it was religious. Still, for all the artifact catalogs and radiocarbon samples, a stubborn mystery remains. What exactly were the social dynamics that knitted Ocmulgee's people together? Were they primarily farmers whose surpluses allowed elite accumulation, or something stranger, an economy centered on ritual that created value through shared religious performance? The truth is likely to include both, complicated by fluctuations in climate, warfare, and trade. We can measure soil chemistry and date charred hearths. We cannot taste the sweat of those who carried the soil. We can model trade flows. We cannot step into the minds of those who used a copper plate as a symbol of authority. And so the mound persists as both evidence and enigma. We still don't know. Now move northward into the Georgia foothills where a different kind of monument waits. Kolomoki mounds, older than many of the large Mississippian complexes, reaching back into the woodland period between roughly 350 and 750 CE. Here the scale is smaller in comparison to later Mississippian giants, but the arrangement speaks to careful social design, a central plaza framed by mounds of different sizes and shapes, some platform-like, others conical and funerary. Measurements taken during modern archaeological surveys indicate large plazas, open communal spaces, that were engineered to match the social rhythms of feasting, craft production, and burial ceremonies. Artifacts recovered include intricately stamped pottery of the Swift Creek tradition, elaborate copper pieces, and a variety of worked stone and bone items. These suggest a society with sophisticated artisanship, stylistic traditions, and connections to broader trends across the Southeast. Key discoveries at Kolomoki also highlight the interplay between feasting, ceremony, and power. Large-scale feasting deposits, pits filled with animal bones and charred plant remains, suggest periodic communal events that brought people together from dispersed hinterlands. Some scholars read these as competitive displays of elite generosity, where leaders gained prestige by hosting and redistributing food. Others interpret them as communal ritual expressions that reinforced group identities without necessarily centralizing political power. There's also the question of settlement pattern. Were these mounds the center of a dense, urban-like population, or were they ceremonial hubs connected to widely dispersed farmsteads? Field surveys show both small domestic sites and elaborate ceremonial architecture, but parsing the ratio of ritual to domestic practice remains difficult. Then there are anomalies that complicate neat narratives. At Kolomoki, for instance, the presence of exotic goods, pieces of copper and marine shell, raises questions about the range and intensity of trade networks during the woodland period. How did inland societies secure marine shell in an era without the long-established Mississippian trade routes? Did riverine connections carry goods with surprising efficiency, or were there itinerant traders who moved objects and ideas across hundreds of miles? And what do those objects say about social relationships? Were they status markers, ritual paraphernalia, or utilitarian tools revalued as symbols? Once again, competing theories have traction. One set emphasizes the early development of complex social networks and proto-chiefdoms. The other emphasizes episodic, relational interactions among kin-based groups. Kolomoki also invites mythic explanations. Folk tales of buried people and giant skeletons, stories that often surfaced in 19th century accounts, interact with archaeological reports of deep burial pits and elaborate grave goods. While 19th century sensationalism sometimes distorted facts, the human penchant for myth persists, especially when a place's scale implies great labor and lost authority. Imagine standing in the Kolomoki Plaza at daybreak, the mist in the flatlands stirring like breath, and picture the ritual choreography, drums, painted bodies, processions, that might have once animated this space. Even if those images are partly projection, they help us feel the social pulse that made Kolomoki's mounds possible. Yet, as with the other sites, we arrive at a stubborn conclusion. While we can date the pottery styles and map the plazas, the precise social logic, whether chiefly communal or some mixture, remains debated. Archaeology gives us outlines. Human imagination supplies possible textures. Between them lies an irreducible uncertainty. We still don't know. Each of these places, the shell rings, the river mounds, the woodland plazas, offers a distinct puzzle and a shared puzzle. How do we translate human intention across centuries when every artifact is stripped of its original breath? In the pieces that follow, we will walk lake shores and island bars, grasslands and carved stone faces, each time moving through the same patterns, a one-sentence tease that names the place and its riddle, a careful look at dates, cultures, and measurements, an inventory of finds, a respectful presentation of competing explanations, a touch of myth, and an invitation to imagine. We'll bring in giants where locals whisper of them, ancient voyagers who might have crossed the coasts and brought tools and tales, and lost tribes whose footprints are faint and partially erased by time and tide. We will not be content with sterile cataloging. We will insist on imagery, fog clinging to fields, drums echoing through the night, because these are human stories meant to be told aloud. Before I continue, hear this: archaeology often works like a detective story without a complete file. Clues exist, and sometimes they point strongly in one direction, but often they point to multiple, coexisting possibilities. When the evidence is ambiguous, people tell stories. Those stories can mislead, but they can also illuminate cultural memories that science alone might miss. I'll be careful with claims, but I'll also honor the human impulse to narrate, to imagine, and to place ourselves inside the mysteries. Keep your curiosity, and keep your skepticism. And now, let's step deeper into the marshes, the mounds, the islands, and the hills, because Georgia's land is patient, and it has many secrets waiting for the next person who will listen with both eyes and imagination. We still don't know. Teaser: Etowah Mounds, an enormous earthen citadel on a river bend whose terraces, plaza, and carved shells speak of a polity that could marshal thousands of hands yet leaves us arguing about who really ruled and why. Imagine standing on a bluff above the Etowah River where the air smells of low water and clay, and in the near distance 3-step platform mounds rise like deliberate islands of earth, their profiles visible for miles and their flat summits once topped by timber halls painted with bright pigments that have long since faded. Etowah's main occupation ranges within the Mississippian horizon, roughly 1000 to 1550 c, though earlier woodland activity brackets the margins. The largest platform mound rises some 20 feet above the plaza level and covers an area comparable to a modest city block, while surrounding berms and the central plaza together form an architectural complex that measures several hectares. Excavations have revealed domestic floors, storage pits, and burials, but the finds that capture attention are the elite regalia, copper plates embossed with winged figures, finely made shell gorgets, mica ornaments polished to a mirror sheen, and carved stone pipes whose iconography echoes motifs across the southeast. Those artifacts tell us two clear things. First, the people at Etowah were part of broad interregional networks that transmitted ritual imagery and valued raw materials. Second, the society invested extraordinary labor in public architecture and ceremonial life. But what that social investment means, whether it indicates centralized chiefly authority, confederated religious leadership, or a more subtle, rotating system of social prestige, remains disputed. One school of thought reads Etowah as a classic Mississippian chiefdom, where a hereditary elite used ritual and economic monopolies, control of long-distance trade in copper and marine shell, the distribution of prestige goods, and the ability to call labor for mound construction, to concentrate power. This interpretation leans on the clear presence of elite burials with exotic goods and the platform mounds that seem built to elevate particular houses or temples above ordinary dwellings. Yet other scholars point out that the distribution of household items and the size of the central plaza are compatible with a civic ceremonial center where leadership might have been situational. Leaders could have emerged through ritual performance and reciprocal feasting rather than rigid coercion. The isotopic signatures in some human bones suggest diverse diets and possible movement of people into the center, hinting at a pull of pilgrimage and seasonality that complicates a picture of simple political dominion. Add to the archaeological data the historical layer, early European travelers and 19th-century collectors who recorded stories of tall chiefs and sacred mounds, and the narrative fragments multiply. Some local folk tales amplify the physical evidence into legends. Stories of a buried king whose copper breastplate still hums under moonlight, or of nighttime drums that echo from the plaza where no one stands. Picture yourself at twilight on the Etowah Plaza, the field grass whispering, imagining a procession, painted bodies, leaders ascending mound terraces, the clang of copper ornaments catching torchlight. Now, let's be fair, environmental pressures and agricultural surpluses likely played a role in Etowah's prominence. Maize agriculture, increasingly evident in Mississippian diets, could support denser populations and ritual schedules that demanded spectacle. Yet for all the radiocarbon dates clustered in the first millennium CE and for all the artifactual patterns that tie Etowah into a southeastern cosmology, a stubborn question remains: how did power actually work here? Through lineage and hereditary rule, through ritual performance and redistribution, or some hybrid we have not yet imagined? We still don't know. Teaser: Rock Eagle Effigy, an enigmatic stone bird carefully arranged by hands long gone, its outline several meters across, raising the improbable possibility of ritual landscapes and cultural memory preserved in unworked boulders. Drive inland to Putnam County and you'll find, unassuming in a scrubby oak woods, a vast figure laid out with hundreds of thousands of pieces of quartzite and stone, its wings spanning roughly 100 feet, and its body forming a bird-like silhouette best seen from above, an oddity in a state where large stone effigies are otherwise extremely rare. Early investigations placed Rock Eagle's construction in a broad pre-Columbian timeframe, and more refined studies suggest a woodland period origin, perhaps placing its primary construction somewhere around 1000 BCE to 100 CE, though dating stone arrangement is notoriously difficult without associated organic materials. Archaeologists did find nearby hearths and cultural debris, and later excavations uncovered human burials and pottery fragments that help frame the site in a ceremonial context. The measurements themselves are arresting. The figure's head, indicated by a concentration of quartz pieces, a defined tail, and two outstretched wings imply a concerted design, not a random scatter. The assemblage raises practical questions about labor investment, social organization, and symbolic intention. How many people worked to assemble the figure? What tools did they use to collect and position hard quartz? And why choose such an emblem as a bird? A dominant hypothesis treats rock eagle as a mortuary or ceremonial marker, an effigy tied to cosmology, perhaps signaling a clan totem or a sky deity. This theory is supported by the proximity of burials and by parallels in iconography where birds often symbolize the upper world, sky travel, or shamanic ascent. Another perspective suggests the figure functioned as a territorial marker, a visible claim to a landscape by a group asserting control over resources such as hunting grounds or river corridors. There's also the intriguing idea that such effigies were durational performances, meant to be walked around, incorporated into processional routes, or periodically refreshed, so the labor was as much social as symbolic. Then there are the more sensational claims that surface in popular lore, footprint-sized depressions interpreted as marks of giants who walked the land before lesser people, or late 19th century recollections of early European explorers who called the figure the work of an old race. These tales often mix the real, the observed, and the imagined. Picture yourself crouched beside the head of rock eagle, the crushed quartz biting into the earth, the forest hush broken only by a distant tractor, and imagine the original builders, clothed or painted, singing or silent, placing stone with careful hands as dusk slides toward a dark sky. Scientists can analyze nearby charcoal for radiocarbon dating, study soil chemistry to detect trampling or recurrent fires, and compare pottery styles to regional typologies. Yet a stone arrangement like rock eagle resists easy categorization because the stone itself cannot be directly dated without associated organics. That epistemic gap invites competing narratives and cautions against definitive claims. We can say the figure is intentional, large, and likely ceremonial. We can model social labor and imagine a ritual calendar that included the effigy. But we cannot yet say with certainty whether it commemorated a single event, functioned as a long-term ritual center, or marked a boundary that mattered in ways lost to time. The stone bird is a prompt, a question carved in rock that asks us to imagine not only its makers but also the reasons they would go to such trouble. We still don't know. Teaser: Cumberland Island's shell-bearing hills and colonial ruins, where towering oyster middens meet Spanish mission fragments and unaccounted for metalwork, suggest a collision of indigenous coastal lifeways, transatlantic contact, and preservation puzzles that refuse a neat timeline. Out on Georgia's southern barrier islands, Cumberland rises as a place where marsh, maritime forest, and river meet the sea, and the archaeological record is a palimpsest of repeated occupation, Paleo-Indian traces, substantial late archaic and woodland shell middens, historic era Timucuan and other indigenous presences, and then European contact beginning in the 16th century. The middens themselves are often massive, sometimes measuring several meters in height and many meters across, layered like geological cakes of shells, fish bones, bone tools, and occasional artifacts of non-local stone or worked shell. Measurements from site surveys show middens that would have required generations of seasonal harvesting and disposal to accumulate, indicating long-term, intensive use of estuarine resources. But amidst the shell and charcoal, excavators occasionally find items that complicate the narrative: fragments of Spanish-era glass and metal, Spanish mission-era ceramics, and trade items whose distribution suggests early contact occurred not as a single event but as repeated, complex interactions between indigenous people and Europeans. One line of inquiry focuses on contact dynamics. Were the early European incursions primarily extractive and violent, displacing indigenous settlements? Or did they begin as episodic interactions where goods and ideas flowed intermittently? The Spanish records, ship logs, missionary accounts, offer fragments but often from a biased viewpoint emphasizing conquest and conversion. On the other hand, the archaeology sometimes suggests continuity of indigenous settlement patterns despite contact, with local communities adapting, or resisting European objects as they saw fit. A particularly vexing set of data revolves around metal objects found in contexts earlier than historical records would predict. Are these truly pre-contact metal artifacts, implying unknown transoceanic voyaging, or later intrusions down into older strata through bioturbation, shellfish burrowing, or post-depositional disturbance? Taphonomic processes in shell middens can be complex. Shells crush and slump, roots push objects down, and storms can redeposit material. Careful stratigraphic control and context-sensitive dating, AMS radiocarbon, optically stimulated luminescence where applicable, are essential to untangling the sequence. There are also more dramatic local legends, stories of Spanish ghost ships, of submerged missions and lost gold, that inflame popular imagination and sometimes drive amateur excavations that further complicate archaeological contexts. Picture yourself on a ridge above Cumberland's salt marsh at low tide, the horizon a strip of silver, and imagine a long line of ancestors carrying baskets of oysters, or Spaniards landing with ragged sails in search of a city of gold, both images imposing different storylines on the same landscape. The scientific posture must be careful. European artifacts found in late Holocene contexts often point to contact, but the exact timing, frequency, and nature of that contact vary by island and site. It's entirely plausible that indigenous communities on Cumberland and adjacent islands engaged selectively with European trade goods while maintaining core subsistence strategies. It's equally plausible that early epidemics, displacements, and violence precipitated collapses in local demography that reshaped settlement patterns. For now, what we can say is this: the archaeological record on Cumberland records long and intensive use, shows contact with European materials at some stages, and resists simplistic narrative resolution because natural processes and later disturbances complicate precise sequencing. We still don't know. Teaser Whisper, Stallings Island, an old river meander near Augusta where shell and bone accumulated into terraces that hint at long-term lifeways and baffling social choices. Imagine the slow sigh of a river and the steady, patient work of people laying down their meals in patterns that became a landscape of memory. Move with me to the fall line where the savannah and its tributaries have carved channels and left behind benchlands perfect for human settlement, and picture a low island of sand and shell rimmed by shallow water, Stallings Island, whose name now marks a distinctive archaeological phase from the late Archaic into the early woodland, roughly between 2500 and 1000 BC, though, and here's where it gets tricky. Dates can vary across contexts, and later disturbances often blur the clear edges of time. Excavations here have revealed dense middens rich in freshwater mussel shell, deer bone, stone tools fashioned from local and non-local cherts, and the earliest pottery types in the region, often tempered with fiber or grit in ways that archaeologists use as cultural fingerprints. The scale of deposition suggests not merely intermittent campfires but places of repeated return, seasonal encampments that, over generations, built up terraces of refuse and craft. Among the discoveries are finely made blades, ground stone tools for processing plant foods, and the earliest curved-stem bone pins that could have been personal items, status markers, or practical tools. These material traces point to a community deeply embedded in riverine resources, skilled in flint knapping and bone work, and increasingly tied to sedentary rhythms that challenge the simplistic hunter-gatherer label often applied to earlier eras. But the evidence also teases us with contradictions. Isotopic analyses on later skeletal materials sometimes suggest mobility and seasonal movement rather than permanent residence. Midden stratigraphy indicates pulses of intense activity followed by quieter moments, and the pottery sequences, while pointing to innovation and cultural continuity, do not neatly map onto a single, unbroken social narrative. Competing theories arise out of these mixed signals. One model envisions Stallings Island as a nucleus of early sedentism driven by abundant river resources and emergent social complexity. As people stayed longer, households specialized, craft skills intensified, and social ties deepened into something that resembled proto-village life. Another model emphasizes mobility and networked households that gathered at Stallings seasonally to exchange goods, marry, and perform collective rituals, after which they dispersed back into the hinterlands. The former highlights accumulation, of shells, of food surpluses, of architecture, while the latter highlights social rhythm and the political economy of gatherings. Environmental change complicates matters. Shifts in river courses, droughts, and colder snaps in regional climate could have encouraged grouping or dispersal at different times. And then there are the more speculative but culturally persistent elements. Local stories, passed down in fragments through colonial records and later oral histories, about people who once lived on the water and left behind shell hills that sing when the tide is low, images that are part symbolic, part mnemonic. Picture yourself at the pale edge of the midden at dawn, the mist lifting off the river, the skeletons of old hearths low and black in the shell strata, and imagine the daily choreography: women preparing river mussels, men repairing nets and tools, children playing among tossed shells, elders keeping count of seasons by the shine of certain stars. Such a scene folds together craft, food, and meaning in a way that radiocarbon dates alone cannot fully capture. Still, for all the shell counts, pottery seriation, and microbotanical analyses, a stubborn question persists. Were Stallings Island's terraces the result of sedentarization and emergent hierarchy, or the fossilized trace of repeated, seasonally timed social gatherings that left behind the detritus of many lives intersecting? We still don't know. Teaser whisper: Nekuchi and the North Georgia Ridge Mounds, a highland pocket near the Appalachian foothills where a platform mound and burial deposits sit at a crossroads between mountain lifeways and riverine exchange, suggesting an upland story that resists easy fitting into coastal or valley models. Walk with me to the valley of the Chattahoochee's upper tributaries where, on a low north-facing bench, the earth rises into a modest but unmistakable man-made mound surrounded by a scattering of burial pits, stone tools, and pottery sherds whose stylistic markers place them within the Mississippian horizon and its antecedents, roughly from the first millennium C through the contact era. Yet whose social logic seems inflected by upland life, smaller fields, steep slopes, and an economy that balanced agriculture with hunting and gathering across varied microenvironments. Excavations in the Nekuchi area have revealed not only mortuary practices, bundled or extended burials sometimes accompanied by utilitarian grave goods, but also evidence of long-distance exchange, marine shell beads and copper fragments that must have traveled down rivers from the Gulf or been brought overland by networks of trade and kin. Measurements of the mound's dimensions indicate a structure smaller than the great floodplain platform mounds but nonetheless significant in a highland context. Its presence reorients our understanding of how Mississippian-style social practices spread into the hills, and it raises questions about local adaptation and cultural translation. The key discoveries suggest a community improvising Mississippian idioms, mound building, platform structures, ritual objects, within a distinctive mountain ecology. Some scholars argue that Nekuchi represents a localized adoption of broader southeastern ceremonial norms, wherein upland groups used Mississippian-style monuments to anchor emerging social hierarchies or to participate in regional ritual circuits. Another perspective posits that upland mound building may have followed different motives, perhaps localized strategies to claim and manage seasonally productive benches, to memorialize ancestors in a landscape less hospitable to large-scale agriculture, or to create nodes for interregional exchange in a terrain where travel was more difficult. The presence of interment clusters alongside domestic features complicates a neat separation between ceremonial and everyday life. Mortuary variability, some burials richly furnished, others spare, suggests differential social standing, but whether that standing was political, ritual, or simply relational is an open question. And then comes the human voice, the mythic overlay mountain tales speak of people of the ridge, and of spirits that guard the old mounds, stories that colonial settlers recorded with a mixture of awe and misunderstanding, sometimes transmuting local histories into legends of vanished kings or of preternatural builders. Picture yourself in the hush of a Nekuchi morning, fog braided through the oaks, the small mound a low heart in the open, and imagine a procession winding up the slope, lanterns bobbing, a few gleaming shells on a cord, a priest or elder speaking names that tether the living to the dead. Now, let's be fair, upland communities were not simply passive recipients of Mississippian influence. They negotiated, resisted, and reinterpreted external forms according to local needs and capacities. Agricultural intensification likely differed here. Maize may have been important but not the sole economic driver, and so the translation of platform mound architecture into the highlands must have been selective, creative, and at times experimental. Still, despite detailed stratigraphic records, soil chemistry, and artifact analysis, certain puzzles persist. Why build a mound in a place where the carrying capacity seems limited? Was the mound a statement, a claim to a landscape, a place to anchor ritual calendars, a headquarters for a local elite? Or was it a communal monument created to stabilize seasonal gatherings for exchange and marriage negotiation? Did the beads and copper come through long-developing trade networks that wove the mountains to the Gulf? Or were they the spoils of episodic contact with traveling traders and emissaries? Archaeometry, elemental analysis of metal and shell, ceramic petrography, can suggest origins for raw materials, but it cannot, by itself, reconstruct the social strings that wrap those goods in meaning. Between the Nekuchi Mound's modest profile and the larger Mississippian centers lies an interpretive gulf that refuses tidy resolution. We still don't know. We step back, breathe in the layered air of marsh and mound and ridge, and feel how each site tightens the circle of questions rather than neatly closing it. Each artifact, each trench profile, each oral memory opens another door into a house whose rooms we can only glimpse. The work of archaeology, dating hearths, analyzing isotopes, mapping pottery styles, gives us a scaffold to hang stories on, but the richness, the color, the lived textures are still subject to imagination and caution in equal measure. Picture yourself walking from Stallings Island's shell-hilly terraces to Nekuchi's ridge-top mound in your mind's eye. The change in ecology shifts the kinds of questions you ask about labor, foodways, and ritual. Some sites shout hierarchy in copper and platform mounds. Others whisper social rhythm in shell and flint. All of them, in their different ways, ask us to imagine the lives of people who thought across seasons, who measured the world in tidal cycles and corn yields and genealogies. We press instruments to the earth and them to our lips. What did you mean when you placed that stone? Why did you burn that pit on that particular day? And the earth answers in increments, date ranges, dietary signatures, traces of trade. Yet because each answer is partial, the imagination rushes in, turning data into narrative, numbers into scenes. That interplay, between method and myth, between lab bench and fireside tale, makes these Georgia places not museum relics but living questions. We started this journey because our expectations of Georgia, interstates, shopping malls, familiar skylines, did not match what the land quietly keeps: concentric rings of shell and charcoal, platform mounds that lift flat-topped summits like stages above river floodplains, stone birds that can only be seen as designs when you step back and imagine an aerial eye, middens so deep they become hills. Small upland mounds that refuse to be dismissed as mere knolls. After walking those sites with dates, measurements, artifacts, competing theories, and the persistent hum of myth, what remains is not tidy closure but a deeper sense of why this ambiguity matters. The unresolved questions we've collected are not failures of method. They are openings in the story we inherit and must keep trying to read. Each site we visited, those shell rings on the coast where oyster and clam refuse congealed into circles, the great riverine plazas and platform mounds that tied politics to labor, Kolomoki's woodland precision, Etowah's copper sheen, Rock Eagle's stony silhouette, Cumberland's layered middens and early contact puzzles, Stallings Island's shell terraces, and Nekuchi's upland mound, offers a different way that people have made place meaningful. Taken together, they form a chorus of human responses to environment, chance, trade, ritual, and imagination. And it is this chorus, sometimes harmonious, sometimes dissonant, that tells us as much about our ancestors as any single artifact could. Think for a moment about what these sites have in common, and what they diverge on. Common to many is a high degree of attention to particular places, rings, mounds, middens, terraces, effigies. Each concentrates human labor, attention, ritual, and memory into a landscape. People return to the same edges and benches and islands not merely out of convenience but because those places had affordances: abundant oysters at low tide, river terraces safe from floods, hills that catch breezes and set apart a plaza for public life. People invested effort, moving soil, collecting stone, shaping pottery, forging copper, because meaning aggregated around place. But divergence appears when we try to read the social grammar that gave those places their rules. Some sites shout ceremony, in the scale of their mounds and the exotic origin of some goods. Others whisper, gathering, or economy, in the repetitive nature of midden deposits, or the seasonal fluctuation visible in plant and animal remains. The contrast matters because it shows us that pre-contact societies in Georgia did not obey a single template. They adapted, improvised, and borrowed. They were neither uniformly egalitarian nor uniformly hierarchical. Instead, they were complex human systems that experimented with forms of power, trade, and ritual across different ecologies. Now, let's be blunt about what modern science brings to these conversations and what it cannot. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, isotope chemistry, ceramic seriation, remote sensing, these tools let us bracket time, trace diet, identify trade links, and map the scale of construction. They provide a scaffold on which credible narratives can be built. But any scientist will tell you that the scaffold is not the house. A radiocarbon range tells you when charcoal burned but not the meaning of the ritual that caused it to be burned. Isotope ratios can reveal that someone ate fish more than maize. They do not tell you whether that diet was a matter of choice, necessity, or ceremony. Stonework like Rock Eagle demonstrates intention and communal labor. It doesn't hand us a blueprint that reads the minds of its makers. Because of these limits, multiple, often contradictory models can seem plausible at once. That is not an indictment of science but a recognition of the fundamentally interpretive nature of archaeological storytelling. The interpretive richness here is why we should resist two temptations. The first is the temptation to impose a single narrative, an all-encompassing political model, a monocausal explanation, because it is tidy and pleasing. The second is the temptation to abandon method in favor of pure speculation, to read giants and lost continents into the gaps without testing claims against data. Both extremes impoverish our relation to the past. Instead, a balanced approach holds several possibilities at once. We can accept the evidence for trade networks that reached from coast to upland ridges and also accept that rivers and marshes often structured local lifeways more than long-distance exchange did. We can accept that some sites show signs of elite accumulation, burials with copper, platform mounds used for elevated structures, and also accept that communal feasting, seasonal gatherings, and ritual performance distributed social power in ways that make leadership more fluid than modern hierarchies. We can take seriously indigenous oral traditions about sacred landscapes without letting them replace stratigraphic control or radiocarbon dates. The goal is not to collapse complexity into a single tidy story but to let the messiness itself be instructive. There is also a vital ethical dimension to these mysteries that we must not gloss over. Many of the people who made these places are ancestors of living communities, descendants who carry traditions, names, and connections to the landscape that science alone cannot disentangle. The way we speak about these sites matters not only for academic accuracy but also for the dignity of those communities. When archaeologists partner with native nations, when museum texts include indigenous voices and interpretations, and when public narratives avoid exoticizing or erasing living lineages, our study of the past becomes a shared act of stewardship rather than a unilateral excavation. Some of the legends we heard, giants, ring people, ghostly processions, are indeed colorful and sometimes superficially sensational, but they often encode deeper memories and relationships to place. Respecting those stories as part of the ongoing conversation is not the same as unquestioningly accepting every claim. It is the ethical work of acknowledging that the past is a living inheritance. We must also talk frankly about the ways environment shaped these lives and their material traces. Sea level changes, storm surges, river avulsions, droughts, and colder decades all rearrange the options available to human groups. The barrier islands that supported dense showering communities were not static. Salt marshes migrated, inlet channels shifted, and storms periodically remade shorelines. Inland, floodplain dynamics and the concentration of alluvial soils favored certain forms of agriculture and settlement. In the uplands, slope and microclimate limited large-scale farming but offered other resources and strategic positions. When archaeological models consider only social or political drivers without integrating paleoclimate and geomorphology, they risk missing half the story. Conversely, environmental determinism, arguing that climate alone drove social change, fails to account for human agency, creativity, and resilience. The truth lies in a dance. Climate opens and constrains possibilities. Human societies, through ritual, trade, political innovation, and stubbornness, shape outcomes within those constraints. Another part of the story concerns technology and exchange. Copper working, shell bead manufacture, and pottery tempering techniques traveled through these landscapes, sometimes as commodities and sometimes as ideas. Movement of raw materials, chert, mica, copper, marine shells, signals networks not merely for trade but for connection, marriages, pilgrimages, alliances, and perhaps ritual obligations. When an inland grave contains marine shell beads, that bead is both an object and a story of distance collapsed, a tangible record of an individual connected to a web far beyond the valley where they lived. That web matters because it rewrites simplistic notions of isolated prehistoric peoples. Georgia's past was entangled in larger southeastern trajectories, and that entanglement complicates any narrative that reduces the past to local, uniform practices. And then there is the human element you feel when you stand in these places, the scale of labor that built a mound, the patience that accumulated a midden, the care that arranged quartz into a bird-shaped silhouette. Those acts matter because they are gestures of meaning. Building a mound is an investment, of time, of social organization, of vision. The rock bird is not only an object, it is an enactment of symbol. Cooking shellfish into the same place for generations is not only subsistence, it is a slow ritual accumulation that, over time, turns daily life into landscape. These actions reveal a deep human desire to mark time and relationship, the urge to anchor memory in the earth so that subsequent generations might read the marks and know they are not alone. What, then, should we do with these unresolved mysteries? The first step is to keep looking with rigor, better stratigraphic control, more AMS radiocarbon dates from secure contexts, detailed paleo-environmental reconstruction, and respectful collaboration with descendant communities. Advances in archaeometry, ancient DNA, high-precision isotopic mapping, and refined sourcing of lithics and metals offer new ways to test old hypotheses. But science alone is not sufficient. We must also listen to oral histories, to place names, to archival fragments that record how early visitors perceived these landscapes. Combining methodological precision with cultural humility will produce narratives that are more robust and more just. Finally, remember why these ambiguities matter beyond academic curiosity. They contest the modern habit of assuming completeness, the idea that any human problem has a single, final solution. In contrast, the landscapes of Georgia model a useful humility. They remind us that human life is often situated in contexts that resist tidy classification. They show how ritual, economy, environment, and memory intertwine in messy, generative ways. They invite us, politicians, students, neighbors, descendants, to inhabit a more patient form of knowing, one that tolerates not knowing as an active stance rather than a failure. So stand with me once more on a low mound at dusk. Feel the mosquitoes in the wind, hear a dog bark in the distance, see the horizon press flat with the promise of stars. Imagine the hands that carried soil to raise that platform, or the hands that set quartz stones into a winged figure, or the bodies that gathered again and again on an island to eat oysters until the shells built a hill. Think of the lives threaded through those places, some ordinary, some rich in prestige, all embedded in a web of meaning only partially recovered. Let us not rush to close the book on these places with a single argument. Let us instead practice a different kind of curiosity, one that collects evidence, weighs hypotheses, listens to living voices, and returns again and again to a place with more questions than answers. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.